toward a better understanding of the book of Revelation. Revelation 12-22. John is now given a picture of the soul of man in its development since the beginning in a historical sense, showing the relationship of the conscious mind to the subconscious, and which came first. The great wonder is symbolic of the human soul, fully illumined and in control of consciousness, crowned with the 12 basic patterns of man. Her child is the active principle of mind, the conscious mind, as we call it. None of this is as yet come into materiality. Simultaneously, a parallel activity takes place. With the coming of the conscious mind, the rival force of self-will occurs, which brings about recurring periods of rebellion in man. However, through divine intervention, the conscious mind is taken into protective custody, while the unconscious mind from which it has sprung is withdrawn below the conscious level, where it continues to be supplied for a period. The forces of rebellion are removed from the levels of mentality, and now have their place in the body. It is now the duty of the human mind to control the rebellious urges coming from the physical as a result of experience in the world. Rebellion from the physical next brings conflict into the soul, persecution, but the soul can remain above it by remaining concealed from the forces of self-will. The emotions coming as a result of the struggles between the soul and self-will are absorbed by the body, but there remains ever the danger of continued attacks upon all established ideals. From a point of detached observation, John now perceives how forces for the expression of selfish desires arise through the emotions which are capable of ruling man. Attributes of these forces are treachery, error, and boastfulness. The power springs from the self-will of the unspiritualized intellect of man. Because of ability of this force to bring about certain miraculous transformation, the world worships the intellect as a symbol of success. During the period of its apparent unobstructed license to indulge itself, the human intellect, lacking spiritual orientation, cuts itself off from all that is divine. Yet, so great is its influence that it begins to take control of all those in the world who have no particular belief in a higher power, who don't actually know in what they truly believe. However, those who have overcome through experience in the world know that whatever appears to be happening, the law of cause and effect goes on perpetually and inexorably. The unspiritualized mentality is shown as a deceiving intelligence which persuades mankind to embrace false values of what is wonderful and miraculous in the world, to set up discriminations against those who retain their spiritual values. Thus all are forced to bind themselves to the institutions of the world and its systems. The intellect can be either the instrument of man's salvation or his degeneration. John now observes, within the collective mind of man, the higher forces going into action. As the forces of Christ consciousness in the world are maintained through the 144,000 perfect souls in the world, new experiences come about, not only in the presence of the universal forces, but also in that of the lower natures and the senses. However, the new experience that comes to each soul of the immanence of God as the source of all supply is limited to those who have exercised self-control throughout. Worship of God is urged and recommended. As the teachers in the world seek to have mankind glorify God, it is shown at a point that the pattern for earthly riches and success in the gratification of the senses is breaking up as the forces for balance in the world bring men into contact with the consequences of their prostitution of their higher faculties and talents. Yet, as even these realize their mistakes and seek to change, realizing that only the body is bound, these find redemption, too. As the over-self of the collective unconscious judges the world, each soul reaps according to what he has sown. And the experience each has had in the world is now refined and ennobled to be made acceptable in the light of the Christ pattern, by bringing these under control also during the period of trial. John perceives now within the soul of man, or that known as the collective unconscious, the souls of individual men are purified and tested on 7 levels of consciousness. as he has already found in his own experience. The 144,000 perfect souls, by reason of their own integrated state of emotional and spiritual natures, remain stable in the face of any eventuality because they bear within themselves the stamp of law. That is to say, divine law or purpose. John perceives that all men encounter the conditions sooner or later, where the experience of the four lower centers, the mentality of same that is, come against the perfect patterns for those centers. This might be described as the activation of conscience, since the discrepancies between the perfect pattern and the actual experiences are now shown up in bold relief. The final steps of the individual for perfect service take place within the mind as all guilt feelings, which result from these sevenfold tests, arise to cloud the mind for this period. When all 7 levels have been purified, then, and only then, can a man achieve mastery of himself. Instructions are now issued for the purification of the gonads, which John witnesses. Physical diseases follow as a result of the misuse of the sex forces, in opposition to the pattern of perfection carried with them. The misuse of the forces of the adrenals result in sapped energies, and the misuse of the forces of Leydig bring about a shutting off of the powers of natural healing and supply. This has always been sensed by man through his emotional and mental spiritual nature, as the law governing each. In other words, this has always been generally known. Misapplied love, as on the thymus level, reacts as a consuming force upon the individual. Love must go out, not in. Also, misuse of the thyroid forces bring about the penalties of self-will, stubbornness, bullheadedness, etc. When the stream of memory is dried up, on the pineal level in its turn, cosmic memory on conscious level, new beginnings are possible for the physical, the emotions, and the mental. Propaganda, distortions, stemming from wrong emotional, mental and physical action, become ranged in time against universal truth. This brings about conflict in the world between groups and government. Completion of the 7 ordeals comes when man's institutions and structures, financial, educational, etc., collapse. Concepts and achievements are swept away, because universal truth is fixed, or crystallized. John is to be shown the fate of man's own lusts, his concepts of what would be pleasurable and satisfying in the world, as experienced through the emotions in all peoples. The controlling intelligences of the body as well as the senses have been brought low by misapplication of the spiritual forces through lust. In the depths of the collective id, so to speak, John is shown the archetype of lust and the emotional forces of rebellion that feed it and keep it alive. These emotional forces are drawn from the energies of the mind centers within all parts of man's body, thus depriving or limiting the normal supply for bodily parts. It is explained to John that the influences from the id, as shown in the beast, have taken control of the 7 centers of man's endocrine system, and through this, man is possessed and ruled. As a result, 7 successive cultural cycles are rotated throughout history through the actions of collective man, each one embodying the strengths and weakness contained in the pattern of each center. As within, so without. These are the urges that keep peace from the earth, basic urges of man, which result. However, as the highest forces of evolving man overcome the forces of self, even the 10 basic urges will, in time, fulfill the divine pattern. The archetype of destructive intelligence which rules man through the senses is man-made. The instructor enlightens John that, at a point, the archetype for self-gratification which man has created for himself bogs down through the very complicity and intricacies of its own creations. All people and all human institutions have been deluded and weakened through following a course of self-gratification. The divine nature in man is withdrawn from the archetype which is abandoned to its own destruction. The senses will record a sense of loss of the stimulations and excitements of the archetype for selfish expression, but by implication, adjustment to the new conditions is called for. The energies drawn from useful bodily, mental, and spiritual functions in man are shown to have been the nourishment upon which this pattern of man's collective selfishness has fed. In Chapter 11, what was the final salvation of the bodily, mental, spiritual forces in John as an individual, now are shown to take place in collective man. When man instinctively recognizes the divinity within him as the controlling force in the world, and turns away from his own selfish pattern of living for self alone, the pattern disappears and the senses together with the four lower centers are realigned with the creative forces. The intelligence who takes over John's instruction now is the over-self of collective man, the pattern for mankind. This instructor points out that the merging of the evolved self with the over-self which has taken place with him, John, must also take place in all men. John seeks to worship his instructor, but is warned against it, having a mission to perform as John has. He is told to worship God, the unformed, for the stamp of the Christ pattern is in the constant application of divine truth. The fulfilled pattern of evolved man, the Christ, is shown now in a position of stability, power, and judgment. All rulership of divine and worldly forces are turned over to him. He is in control of the law of cause and effect, karma. He is able to feed his mind on all that is best in earth experience, and draw sustenance from it, but to reject the former lusts and errors. Individualized man has merged with collective self. Now the archetype of man's continual rebellions, the self-willed intellect, itself is confined for a time in the collective id. During this 1,000-year period only the evolved souls incarnate in the earth. With these souls all in perfect balance they would bring balance into the very forces of earth itself, perfect peace and harmony to nature itself. At the close of the 1,000-year period, the remaining souls begin to incarnate, bringing with them their unsatisfied ambitions and desires. This, of course, brings about the former conditions of imbalance. Wars, plagues. Now the evolved souls are surrounded and their activities curtailed by the unregenerate souls, who only succeed in destroying their physical selves through tampering with natural forces. Once again they must await reincarnation. Here John beholds the universal point of divine emanation as the point of judgment, which is unbiased by material ideals or considerations. Before this judgment, not only are the individual soul records scanned but also the record for collective man, Akasha. Those souls entrapped by uncontrolled emotions, as well as those trapped by their own frustrations and remorse, are now freed. These conditions, all man-made, are now themselves eliminated and all creatures, mental forms and patterns, not formed by divine will are purged. John envisions a perfected state of consciousness and a regenerated body, with the elimination of all unstable emotional behavior. As a result of these conditions, the completed fulfilled soul record of man moves into place containing all the riches of earthly experience in presentable order. It is explained that the divine touches man at the level of the superconscious in indissoluble union with man, in a collective sense, as well as individual. In the new state, an end is brought to the abrasion of natural experience in the world. The formed conditions have passed. The collective superconscious calls attention to his powers for regeneration and bids John record the fact. The superconscious is custodian of all supply, and when an individual establishes self-control, supply control will be restored to him. The fearful, the unbelieving, the impostors, etc., do not experience this since they have cut themselves off. The Overself, speaking on the level of the pituitary, offers to explain John's relationship to himself. The soul record of man is reviewed, which contains 12 basic human patterns in terms of recorded time, space, and motion. Its perfection is gauged according to the standard always carried within the superconscious, Overself, and the attributes listed which symbolize man's perfected experiences in the world. Man's mind at this point is now divine in the perfection of control and is free of outside limitation. John is shown the flowing forces which come from the combined will of God and the will of man flowing from a point at which man merges with the divine. This energy nourishes the system for healing and supply in the physical, regularly, and the age-old limitations of man are to be removed as a result, as all things are brought into perfect order. The merging of man's conscious mind with the Christ mind will bring about sufficient illumination for perfect service. This knowledge needs to be passed on to those who will make use of it. To those who apply themselves to the study of this knowledge, the instructor superconsciousness comes quietly. John, again, seeks to worship the figure emblematically shown and is told to worship God only. Judgment on the world will come quickly as each individual is found deep in his own earthly activity for good or evil, wherever he may be. Those operating within the divine law will be found in control of all healing and supply from within and or in possession of their souls or God conscious. The Over-Self reveals the source of his knowledge. The book is the body, which is the vehicle for human experience in the world. Through it the lessons of the soul are learned. There can be no shortcuts or meanderings without dire consequences to it. The end. Commentary. The mental-physical anatomy of man as outlined here by John seems to show much the same understanding of the functions of the body-mind relationships as modern science has found. However, where modern science has only begun to develop an understanding of the effects of mental attitudes upon the body through the study of psychosomatics and its therapy, John's record declares that the state of the mind, its thoughts, its desires and its conflicts, etc. are reflected at all times in the state of the body. And of course, the state of the body has its effect on the mental outlook. The way, then, to change and heal the body is to change the mind and its attitudes. The first bodily organs to feel and respond to this, John says, will be the endocrine system, keys to all bodily changes. If we can accept this, then man is responsible not only for how he thinks and feels on the conscious level but also what happens to him as a result of what his unconscious attitudes attract. However, the greater part of his mind lies beyond his reach, so to speak. This would seem a complete and final obstacle to any aspirations he might have towards establishing total self-control. Or so it seems. John suggests that the key to this dilemma lies in the superconscious mind. By putting the forces of the body-mind back in order, this level of consciousness is released into action. First as a guide and instructor during the processes of cleansing and purification, and finally merging with the personality, and operating on the conscious level. Any man acting in complete superconsciousness, the implication is, would be as a god. This has been the goal of all mystics through the ages and the story of their seeking. This is the explanation of the state of Christhood, the archetype of the evolved man. To the psychologist who has spent long years in the study of the human mind in action, it becomes increasingly clear that present-day knowledge is inadequate for dealing with the problems of people who have become victims of their own tensions and conflicts. Most exploration, so far, seems to have been in the area of the subconscious, the repository of all patterns of repeat actions, of a mechanistic nature. By bringing to the surface something of the residue of this area, it is hoped that the individual will recognize the cause of his problems and be automatically released from his tensions. In many cases this appears to work very well indeed. In an equal number of cases, however, the results are completely unpredictable. If John's information is worth study by the scientific men, as the readings suggest, it may be found that the present assumption that an individual's mentality on the conscious level as the only yardstick to be considered in treatment may have to be abandoned. This may prove not to be in accord with the true situation at all. What if, over the conscious thinking mind of the individual sits a greater mind in judgment, a mind possessing universal scope, which is observing all that is happening and perhaps bringing about its own conflicts, as its own yardstick for the well-being of the individual is violated? The book of the Revelation implies a course of action. To read it, if only in its interpretation as given here, means nothing. The real book of the Revelation is the body-mind of man, and his true nature is studied and absorbed only by putting the suggested course of action into practice, in everyday living. In the ensuing experience alone, in the overcoming of everyday problems and self, can man be freed to know himself, and in knowing himself to become what he truly is and to fulfill his vast, breathtaking destiny as outlined by John.